Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into one of the most explosive and overlooked arenas of the Cold War, Angola. Now, if you thought the Cold War was just about nukes and spies between the US and the USSR, buckle up, because Africa, too, became a chessboard for global power plays. And Angola? It was right in the middle of the storm. Here's the hook. What happens when an empire suddenly pulls out of a colony and leaves behind a vacuum? Do the people finally gain freedom, or do they become pawns in someone else's game? Let's start in 1975. Portugal, drained by years of colonial warfare and facing revolution back home, decided to wash its hands of its African colonies. Angola was one of them. Now imagine this. One day, you're under colonial rule. The next, the colonial administrators are gone, and three major political movements are left standing in the ruins, all claiming to be the rightful leaders. Those movements were the MPLA, UNITA, and FNLA, and each came with friends in high places. The MPLA was backed by the Soviet Union and Cuba, UNITA backed by the United States and apartheid South Africa, and FNLA had early support too, but quickly faded from the spotlight. This wasn't just a civil war, it was the Cold War in miniature. Think about it. Angola wasn't just fighting over who should govern the country, it was a battlefield for how it should be governed. Centralized Marxist control, Western-aligned capitalism, or something else entirely. Cuba sent troops, the USSR sent weapons, the US sent cash and covert operatives, and South Africa crossed borders with tanks. So by the end of 1975, Angola wasn't just a newly independent country. It had become a proxy war zone, a theater where foreign ideologies were tested not on theory, but on blood-soaked soil. And the real question, the one we'll keep asking, is this: who actually paid the price for all this ideological warfare? Let's zoom in on two of the major players in Angola's civil war, Cuba and the Soviet Union. These weren't just allies of the MPLA. They were architects of a grander vision, one that imagined Angola as a launchpad for global revolution. Let's start with Cuba. Fidel Castro didn't just send troops for fun. He saw Angola as a revolutionary testing ground, a place where Cuba could prove its anti-imperialist credentials and spread the gospel of Marxism beyond Latin America, straight into the heart of Africa. In Castro's eyes, this wasn't just politics. It was theater. Angola became the stage, and the actors were Cuban soldiers, many of them young and idealistic, believing they were fighting to liberate the oppressed. But the script? That was written in Havana. And then there was the Soviet Union. They supplied the props, guns, tanks, advisors, logistics. But more importantly, they saw Angola as a geopolitical node. Not just some dusty battlefield in the global south, but a golden opportunity to plant the red flag in Africa. Every bullet sent, every supply plane landed, it was all part of the bigger game to outmaneuver the West. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Instead of supporting local decision-making or grassroots alliances, both the Soviets and Cubans pushed a command-over-agency model. What does that mean? It means the real decisions weren't being made in Luanda, Angola's capital. They were being made in Havana and Moscow. Local Angolan fighters? They were often relegated to foot soldier status in a war that was no longer fully their own. This wasn't liberation in the true sense. It was top-down intervention, a centralized war effort led by foreign powers, telling local groups how to fight, when to advance, and who to trust. And when you start replacing agency with ideology, when decisions are handed down like military orders instead of earned through cooperation, well, that has consequences. Now let's shift our lens south, to apartheid-era South Africa. South Africa entered the Angolan conflict waving the anti-communist banner. But let's be honest, was it really about ideology, or was it about fear? At the time, South Africa was governed by a rigid, racially segregated regime. Apartheid wasn't just policy, it was survival strategy for a white minority clinging to power. So when Marxist movements began sweeping across southern Africa, South Africa panicked. They feared encirclement. The dominoes were falling. Mozambique, Angola, Zimbabwe, all leaning left, all aligning, at least loosely, with the Soviet bloc. And if Marxist governments took over everywhere around them, what would that mean for apartheid? For their legitimacy, their economy, their global standing? So South Africa didn't just intervene in Angola because of Marxism. They intervened to avoid isolation. They wanted to ensure that at least one buffer, Namibia, remained under their control. Namibia was more than a neighbor. It was a strategic asset, a geographic shield, and more importantly, a corridor to Angola's mineral-rich regions, especially the oil-rich enclave of Cabinda. Control of this corridor meant power, resources, and leverage. But here's the kicker. All of this was cloaked in ideological language. South Africa claimed it was standing against communism, fighting the red tide. But in reality, it was defending its own regime, protecting its racial hierarchy, maintaining access to vital economic resources. The anti-communist rhetoric? That was the costume. The real show was about preserving apartheid and avoiding collapse. So next time you hear a government justifying military action in the name of ideology, ask yourself, what's behind the curtain? All right. Picture this, it's the mid-1980s. Deep in southeastern Angola, the dusty terrain around a town called Cuito Cuanavale is about to become the center of a showdown unlike anything Africa had seen since World War II. Over 50,000 troops, tanks, artillery, jet fighters screaming overhead. On one side, you had Cuban forces fighting alongside Angola's ruling MPLA. On the other, UNITA rebels backed by South Africa's military machine. It was a clash of titans, and it dragged on for months. This wasn't hit-and-run guerrilla warfare. This was trench warfare, artillery barrages, dug-in positions, minefields, aerial dogfights. It felt more like the Western Front of World War I than the hit-and-run style conflicts more typical of African warfare at the time. And yet, for all the firepower, for all the strategy, there was no clear winner. Both sides claimed victory. Both sides spun the outcome for propaganda. But when the dust settled, neither side had achieved what they wanted. South Africa didn't break the MPLA. The MPLA didn't drive out UNITA. And Cuba? Well, it couldn't claim total military dominance either. So what was it all for? This was proxy warfare in its purest form. It wasn't just about Angola anymore. It was about making statements, testing ideologies, projecting power, and, frankly, seeing who could outlast the other. But in the end, Cuito Cuanavale became a symbol, not of triumph, but of exhaustion, a massive, grinding stalemate that drained resources, hardened resolve, and forced everyone to reconsider whether the war was winnable at all. And sometimes, it's not the battle that changes the world, but the questions that rise when no one wins. Let's take a step back from the battlefield and look at the aftermath. Because here's the hard truth. While superpowers debated ideologies and foreign troops traded fire in the name of revolution or anti-communism, the people of Angola paid the real price. The war was catastrophic. Angola's economy, already fragile, collapsed. Entire sectors were wiped out: agriculture, manufacturing, transport. Roads were destroyed, bridges gone, cities turned into ghost towns, and rural areas left with nothing but cratered fields and burnt-out husks. Basic services, schools, hospitals, clean water, disappeared, not because the ideas were wrong in theory, but because centralized war efforts can't sustain real life. They drain resources, they concentrate power in elite hands, they turn survival into a privilege instead of a right. And let's talk numbers. Over 1 million people were displaced. Think about that. Families forced from their homes, wandering through a country they no longer recognized. Civilians caught in crossfire. Children growing up without schools. Whole generations traumatized. All while the political elites, on both sides, maneuvered for position, brokered deals, and shook hands in distant capitals. And this is what centralized war often produces: a hollowed-out society, one where the loudest voices are far from the gunfire, and the people who suffer the most are the ones no one listens to. So the question isn't just who won the battle, it's who lost the peace. And in Angola's case, the answer is clear: the everyday Angolan people. After years of bloodshed, something unexpected happened. Real change started to come, not through conquest, but through conversation. By the late 1980s, all sides were tired. Angola was wrecked. South Africa's economy was strained. Cuba had overextended itself. The Soviet Union? Well, it was on the verge of its own internal collapse. And so, in 1988, came the Tripartite Accord, a major diplomatic breakthrough. Under the agreement, all foreign forces, Cuban and South African, agreed to withdraw from Angola and Namibia. Now that's huge, because for the first time in over a decade, Angolans and Namibians had a real chance to decide their own future, without superpower strings attached. And guess what happened? Namibia gained independence. That long-awaited, long-denied freedom finally arrived in 1990. No invasion, no revolution, just a negotiated process built on mutual withdrawal and recognition. Even more remarkable, this marked the beginning of the end for apartheid in South Africa. The writing was on the wall. With Namibia free and the Cold War winding down, South Africa could no longer justify its regime to the world, or to its own people. So what made this peace possible? Not a centralized command, not an ideological victory, but the decision to step back, to decentralize, and to let local actors shape their own future. In many ways, the end of the war in Southern Africa came not from more control, but from less. It's a lesson we'd be wise not to forget. So, after all the bloodshed, the ideology, the speeches, the proxy deals, what did it really amount to? Because if we're being honest, no one really won the Angolan Civil War. Not in the way they hoped. The centralized systems that tried to impose control, whether communist or anti-communist, left devastation in their wake. The grand ideological visions from Havana, Moscow, Washington, and Pretoria, they didn't rebuild schools, they didn't heal families, they didn't plant crops. In the end, it was cooperation, not conquest, that brought the first steps toward peace. When foreign powers finally stepped back, and local voices were allowed to speak for themselves, that's when we saw progress. Voluntary agreements, local agency, negotiated transitions. It's ironic, isn't it? After all the years of centralized planning and foreign control, it was decentralized choice that proved the most effective path forward. And that's the uncomfortable truth behind this chapter of history. Wars fought in the name of liberation often delay the very freedom they claim to support. So, who really won? Maybe the better question is, what could have been achieved if Angolans had been given the reins from the start? Thanks for watching this episode of Truth Behind History. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the untold stories of global conflict and its real-world consequences, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And if you prefer to listen on the go, check out the podcast version of this episode, links in the description. There's plenty more to uncover, and we've got more episodes on the way. So stick around, because when it comes to history, the truth always finds a way to surface.